All right. How's it going, guys? It's Mr. Velasco here, giving you just another little recap of our second unit of AP US history here. Mr. Ancharsky and I have decided we're going to go ahead and trade off who is doing this sort of YouTube video recap for each unit. So let's go ahead and take a look here. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing of setting a little timer here for about 20 minutes that Mr. Ancharsky had. And yeah, just here's the lesson alignment here. Basically, just we're looking at briefly reviewing the causes for Independence Day, the actual revolution itself, and as well as the cultural impact, that social revolution that happens after the fact. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so very briefly, you would have seen these, some of them at the end of Unit 1. Just a bit of a recap here, long-term context for why independence happens. Now, we kind of saw there's a lot of different reasons why over about 100, 150 years, really the colonies in America kind of developed their own unique culture. We saw, thanks to that practice of salutary neglect, taxes not being enforced, mercantilism not really being adhered to, we see that the colonies kind of formed their own distinct culture of feeling like they are not supposed to be micromanaged by Great Britain. So when that comes to an end, it is a real sore spot immediately. We saw, even from the very beginning, there are some proprietary colonies where the implicit idea was that rich people could then use this land to kind of do whatever they wanted with it. Religious tolerance, different levels of adherence to social structures. And so, really, this idea of always governing themselves has kind of been an issue for a long time now. And naturally, there is now more that is uniting American culture than it is connecting it to British culture. One example being the First Great Awakening that we saw connecting the religious ties of the entire colonies together, uh, rejecting predestination, so the old, more Calvinist take from Britain. And two, there was also that idea that we went into in Unit 1 of virtual versus actual representation. British Parliament believes that simply because they are British citizens, that their interests will be represented by Parliament, even if there's not one specific representative for the colonies in Parliament. Americans don't like that. They prefer, after years of local assemblies like the House of Burgesses and the General Council, they prefer an actual representative who is from their cloth, who's going to vote the way that they want them to, someone who they know will look out for their own interests because it is truly one of them. Those two differences appear very quickly. Short term, we saw, thanks to the French and Indian War, taxation is now on the mind of the British colonies because, sorry, of the British Parliament because the colonies have never really been taxed. And two, thanks to the war, they need money. And so we saw that all of these different internal and external taxes, which a note on that, we saw internal taxes are direct taxes imposed on goods. That caused the Stamp Act and all the resistance to it. There's a jet going outside. We also saw external tax like the Townshend Acts, more like tariffs that just kind of jack up the prices of things indirectly. Either one of them was untenable to the colonists. And so we saw the resistance appears quite harshly, almost immediately. There is organized protests, there are boycotts, there's that idea of homespun virtue, trying to lessen the amount of things that the colonies buy from Britain. And eventually, when we saw the Tea Act trying to enforce another of these mercantilist monopolies for a British company, we see a full-blown act of resistance with the Boston Tea Party. And so these things begin to spiral as both sides kind of refuse to back down. We saw from the Stamp Act, there was that declaratory act declaring that Parliament is supreme. And we saw that the Boston Tea Party is going to lead to those intolerable acts, those coercive acts, where Massachusetts is kind of put under military occupation, effectively, kind of revoking its charter until the tea is paid for. And we see that this very much looks and feels like the tyranny that they've been warning about for so long now. And so Massachusetts begins to stockpile weapons from local militias, starts to organize its own independent group, and finally, blood actually is shed at the battles of Lexington and Concord, 1775. All right? So, with that in mind, we see that even though actually fighting has started now, there is still no obvious idea that we are going to use this to declare independence and try and form our own country. Right now, it just looks like a skirmish, and we're trying to avoid some kind of war. So, as a reminder, there are some people in the colonies, like Benjamin Franklin or John Adams, that are sort of becoming a little more radical, where they do want some kind of formal separation, but they are not the majority. We see that most of the colonists either fall into this moderate or loyalist position here, where the moderates just they want an end to this taxation without representation, but they still are unhappy with what is going on right now. They don't want to split apart. They just want some level of change. And then there are loyalists who are proud to be British citizens because of economic ties, cultural ties, you name it. They actively want to stay British. And so we see that once the intolerable acts remain uh, are not repealed and they are still active for about a year, we see that the First Continental Congress has its second meeting, the Second Continental Congress. And when this group meets with all 13 colonies represented, their goal is not to declare independence. We see that instead, what they are hoping for is some attempt to organize their response and try and negotiate some sort of permanent reconciliation. That's going to be the phrase that they use for that olive branch petition that they author. And again, this is not a declaration of independence. This is an attempt, one last attempt to talk things out with King George so that they can try and avoid some kind of war. And again, many colonists are actively aware that Britain is militarily superior, has economic superiority, and all of our manufacturing comes from Britain. So many colonists realize if we go to a war with Britain, we will not win. So they're trying to avoid war for several reasons. They're not trying to declare independence yet. So what changes? Well, one British immigrant by the name of Thomas Paine, he's going to write a pamphlet, and that is Common Sense. So he arrives in 1774, but writes this pamphlet in 1776, specifically January of that month. And in it, he outlines that basically nothing good has come from being a British citizen in the recent memory. That all that it's done is preserve what he calls the two ancient tyrannies of the pre-Enlightenment world, the tyrannies of monarchy, the tyrannies of aristocracy, different levels of oppression that really clash with this new idea of natural rights and the idea that all men are created equal. And so he argues that this government can't be preserved because it upholds these old archaic customs here. The only way to truly preserve these natural rights is going to be to get rid of that government, to separate from it entirely. And so he also goes into more practical examples of how the French and Indian War has shown that really colonists have nothing to gain from being British anymore. They didn't allow the people from the colonies who fought in that war to actually go settle all that land that they covered. That was that nasty proclamation line of 1763, no white settlement past Appalachia. We see that we're going to war with people who aren't exactly our enemies, the French and the Spanish, and it is we're being tugged in a bunch of different directions by a government that does not seem truly interested in talking it out. That was most evident by their reactions to the Stamp Act with the Declaratory Act, but then also we saw with the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts. This government is not interested in any kind of negotiation. So why should we? Why should we be negotiating? Because clearly it's not working. And so what ends up happening is common sense is heard all across the colonies. It spreads like wildfire. And this one little anonymous document, it is written in plain language, it is written anonymously, and it is enough to swing all of the support towards the actual goal of declaring independence. This one document shifts the conversation across the entire 13 colonies, starting at the local level, leading up to more city and state assemblies, eventually making its way up to the Second Continental Congress. One by one, they now start authoring resolutions that want some kind of total separation from Great Britain. And so, yeah, that was written in January. And then in July is when they actually write the Declaration of Independence. And so, we saw that that means that there is now a huge momentous shift here. This is actively an act of treason, and many of the framers are aware of that. So we see Thomas Jefferson is going to bake those Enlightenment values into this document here. He's basically going to argue that the Enlightenment ideas of natural rights, those should be the guiding principles of a country, that its government should exist to protect those natural rights for the people. None of this divine right of kings anymore. Governments get their power from the consent of the governed. In other words, you have the right to endorse or condemn your own government. They're basically saying a conversation like the one we're trying to have with Great Britain is the way it should go. And perhaps most importantly, there is another part to this declaration, often quoted, that if any government appears that is destructive to these ends of preserving natural rights, then the people have the right to alter or abolish that government. In other words, if the government isn't helping you, you have no obligation to keep serving it. You can simply replace that government with something else or split from it entirely. The signers of the Declaration, they're going to argue that's exactly what they were doing here. We tried talking it out. There was nowhere. That got nowhere. And so this is the next logical step here. We are breaking up. And the rest of the Declaration is just a bunch of specific grievances that King George and Parliament did. That are the reasons why we're breaking up. You know, he's a tyrant, unfair taxation, no representation in Parliament. Talking it out didn't work. It just made things worse. So we have nothing left to gain. And when that happens, and again, it is officially released to the public on July 4th, 1776, the 13 colonies are now in open rebellion and the war begins properly. All right? So, the actual war itself, there's not too much to cover, in fact. The AP doesn't really care about you knowing the exact specifics of the battles and the military tactics and all of that, but here's the short version. So, you can kind of divide the Revolutionary War into kind of three distinct phases that just each go a little further and further south as time goes by. Early on, a lot of the fighting is focused around the north, the New England area, because again, Philadelphia and Boston are kind of considered the centers of rebel activity here. Now, in truth, this first phase from 76 to 77, it goes so badly that in truth, the rebellion almost ended right there. We see that there are several military defeats, some notable ones involving the Battle of Bunker Hill, as well as the Battle of Long Island. And that one in particular was so devastating that it involves the loss of New York entirely, captured by Redcoat forces. And in fact, if it weren't for an act of mercy from the two brothers, General and Admiral Howe, that could have been the end of it right there, because they could have very easily captured Washington's army and just put them to death as traitors. However, they were sympathetic enough and had enough respect for the colonial leaders that they wanted to try and negotiate to see if they could get them to stand down and reassure the government of Britain that the colonies actually don't want to go to war. They're just being misled by a few hot-headed rebel leaders. That small act of mercy allowed Washington and his forces to slip away, and that escape then kind of shifts the focus here. Washington realizes that in order to win, they are going to need to tire out the superior British forces. They can't win head to head, but we can do guerrilla warfare, surprise attacks. We can try and drag this war out, make it as expensive and tiring as possible so the British just lose faith. And despite a bunch of setbacks, like having no real economy, the Continental Congress having no real authority, and any forces or supplies being just requested, not ordered from the states, and desertions on top of that, one by one, they managed to claw out these little surprise victories. Washington crosses the Delaware, like in that photo right there, and ambushes those Hessian forces at Trenton and Princeton, manages to declare an amazing surprise victory, raise morale, get more people to enlist again. And then in that second phase, as we start hitting the middle colonies region, we actually start to see that there is now a notable shift in the Continental forces' favor. The example being the Battle of Saratoga. That was a huge ambush. They're able to capture 8,000 British forces by surprise, by cutting off their supply lines and just waiting them out via siege until this force has no choice but to surrender. That decisive victory suddenly meant that there was enough evidence that the colonies might actually win this war that now an old enemy of the British show up, the French. And finally, they have enough concrete evidence that their forces might be put to good use to form an alliance with the United States. And so we see that at first it's economic support, and then they're trying to just pick off a couple cash crop islands down in the West Indies. But eventually, by 2 years later, they do start to send entire military forces, notably General Rochambeau. So we have Lafayette to thank for that, as well as our favorite ambassadors, Ben Franklin and John Adams. So little by little, the war moves further south, and the British did that on purpose to try and basically go to areas where there was more loyalist support. But nonetheless, the fighting still continues, and eventually, thanks to the help of the French, the Allies, that's not World War II, the Continental forces and the French are able to completely trap a major British force at the Battle of Yorktown and force another costly surrender. And after all these wars of attrition, these surprise victories, and this just 7 years of drawn out conflict, the British realize they simply don't want to do this anymore. They signed the Treaty of Paris and officially recognized American independence. So, the actual specifics of the treaty, we get official independence. Woohoo. They, in theory, are going to remove British forces from all of those forts up in the Northwest, and they actually don't. So, a little bit more on that later. We see that they are going to demand loyalists get compensation. And lastly, we get land all the way up to the Mississippi River. So the country just got bigger, and that treaty is what made it happen there. Treaty of Paris, 1783. That's what makes America America. So, with that in mind, to kind of wrap up here, we see also culturally the revolution is a big symbol in this country. And really, your historians kind of argued about what really changed after the war in American society. And we saw that the progressives and the new left, they're going to argue that really not much changed because, in theory, there was a revolution and we are no longer British citizens. But they're going to make the argument that it was just a group of one rich elite group of white people replacing another group of the same makeup. So, really, true tolerance was a long distant memory. We see slavery still exists, we see inequality and sexism still exist. And they're going to argue that really the revolution was not much of a revolution at all. Meanwhile, the neoconservative group, our neocons, they argue that really the revolution is as glorious as it has always been made out to be. And so we see that among the points that they bring up, they argue that there is now official freedom of religion in the land, the Enlightenment values, separation of church and state. And so there are a bunch of different denominations of Protestant now. There are even some specifically focused for minorities, like the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so there is a lot of things that appear right there. And again, a lot more tolerance for people of various Christian religions. We see that there is a much bigger step towards actual true classless systems in this country. There is no official nobility in America now. There is no one who has a position of power like a lord of nobility can hold office in places like Georgia. We see primogeniture is a thing of the past. And we even see that a few places are actually getting rid of slavery at first, or slowly putting it on the path to eradication. So perhaps there is a true actual balancing of the classes. But perhaps the most important one here is the idea of Republican motherhood. This is the belief that women have a very sacred duty of being the ones to educate their children about the values of a Republican Enlightenment style government. The idea of tyranny is bad, democracy is good, and it's your job to preserve these values by being a good citizen and participating in the system. Now, when I say participate, again, that is mostly meant for men. And so sadly, this is a weird mixed bag because this Republican motherhood, it does imply that women have to understand these values themselves good enough to be able to communicate them. And so that means that they might need to be able to read and write and understand the discourse of the time. But they are specifically teaching their sons these values. Well, the role of women is still very much a domestic one. So it's a weird mixed bag where, although this more champion of education is undoubtedly a leap forward for women's rights at the time, it is also at the same time further entrenching these domestic roles of women being the housekeepers who don't go and advocate for politics, and men are the ones who do. So, in effect, even though there are several eloquent writers like Abigail Adams, pictured right there, or Phyllis Wheatley, who use her poetry to denounce slavery, really, as a whole, women's role in shaping the new culture of the country is really indirect, as rather it's just their sons are going to be the ones that actually get to go out and do these things. So, really, you can look at both of these, all these data points in either interpretation. Because again, the progressives might point to freedom of religion by saying, yeah, that's only for Christians. If you were anything but Christian, good luck. You could see the idea of no nobility of primogeniture as just being a surface level issue, because in fact, there is still very much elitism of upper and lower houses, like we see in the Constitution later, or societies meant on just pure elitism. There are some people that are very snobbish and exclusionary. And again, many founding fathers wanted to preserve some level of elite status, or Republican motherhood, simply confining women to this more domestic, less advocacy filled role. So, regards to which one you fall into, that's up for you to decide. But that's sort of the skinny here of the war itself and the impact that it has culturally afterwards. All right? So, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Talk to your teacher of record for any other clarifying questions. And of course, stay tuned for the next one. We'll take a look next time at what the new government of this country is like, as well as life under its first president. All right. Talk to you later, guys. Catch you with the next one.